I teach social influence, so I've talked about things like Jonestown in class. But there actually are people who publish in the Journal of Cultic Studies. None that I know of here. I don't do that. I know a little bit about social influence, though.
Okay, if anything you want to talk about, like, obviously, I mean, this is kind of a big hype right now, and so, I mean, how do you think people are being, obviously, it's social influence, but what kind of social implements are?
Okay, well, let's see. Let's take Into the World. In the World has come before numerous times. One of the most documented and well-known times that Into the World occurred in social science is found in a book by Leon Fessinger and two of his students, Schachter and Rieken. And it was called When Prophecy Fails. And it actually, I was told, it's not in the book, but I'm told by people who knew the principles, that one of the people involved was a physician here at Sparrow, lost his job over it. There were two separate groups that were sort of into the paranormal and UFOs and things like that. They believed the world was going to come to an end. And so one of them was in Minnesota and one of them was here. So they happened to get wind of each other through newspaper stories, got in contact. The leader of the group in Minnesota predicted the end of the world because she would lapse into these trances and start with the automatic writing stuff. And this other planet, the name of which escapes me, I often confuse it with Fahrenheit 415. I want to say Trantor. It wasn't Trantor. They predicted the world was going to end by a giant flood. So what had to happen, what was going to happen is they were going to whisk down and pick up this woman, Mrs. Keach, and her group, plus these people from Lansing who traveled to Minnesota. Again, in December, late December, cold day. So there you are in Minnesota, and you're standing out in your backyard, and the flying saucers have come. Now, what was interesting to Fessinger is what happens when the prophecy fails. And what he predicted and what came true is that these groups who had never tried to proselytize before, never tried to gain converts, all of a sudden started to after the failure of the prophecy. Mrs. Keach, as a resolution, went back into her room, cried, got another message in automatic writing from this planet that said, because of your faithfulness, we've decided to spare the world. And I'm sure something like that will happen again on 21 December. Winter solstice, at least we won't be sacrificing anybody. It's a relatively harmless way to pass the solstice. Anyway, these were people who were brought together by common interests. They were very much convinced by a charismatic leader, Mrs. Keach, and by Dr. Armstrong here in Lansing as well, that there were such things, and the government wasn't telling us about it, and they had supernatural powers much greater than human powers, and so on. So they were largely just convinced. They were persuaded. They were also drawn to some extent by imitation. These were people they wanted to be like. They wanted to emulate Mrs. Keach and Dr. Armstrong, these leaders. They were charismatic leaders. So there's that sort of influence. But nobody was forcing them to do anything. There's no what we might call compliance pressures being brought, either through rewards or punishments. And there was no real legitimate power, just another kind of social influence being exercised, in the sense that there wasn't some authority figure telling them this would happen. These were, and the guy was a physician, so in some extent authority, but certainly not an authority and somehow on alien life forms. So there wasn't that. It was mainly they were persuaded and they were drawn to imitate people who were, to them, very attractive people they wanted to be like. The interesting thing that happened there is that there were some of the groups, some of the members of each of those groups that were unable to attend that night. And their response was really interesting, as opposed to ones who did attend. The ones who did attend often gave away their cars, didn't sell, gave away the cars, they had no need for money, gave away all their earthly possessions to other people. That's how much they believed in this whole thing. The ones who didn't come disavowed ever believing. actually didn't show up that night. They disavowed it. But the ones who were there were convinced that they were saved because of their faithfulness, and they believed even stronger, which is actually what Fessinger's distance theory would predict. So that's the kind of thing you have coming up in December. Cults are often different kettles of fish. You familiar with Jamestown?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, there were people who wanted to dissent that were actually shot as they tried to get away. So there was a certain amount of compliance pressure put on some of those people, those who wavered, and so Jones actually would threaten them with shooting if they didn't drink the Kool-Aid. But he also did convince a lot of those people. They were actually folks who thought he was God. There were certainly people who would have looked to him as a role model, type of influence we call referent power. They saw him as a charismatic leader that they would want to be similar to if they could, if only they could. And some thought he was a legitimate authority, legitimately the voice of God on earth. So, 4 types of social influence. Some people were actually persuaded, really experienced attitude change. Some were forced at gunpoint. Some thought he was legitimately the voice of God and had a right to tell them what to do. And others were someone for whom he was a role model and they wanted to be just like him. So there's a lot more different kinds of influence in, say, Jonestown than there was in When Prophecy Fails. Generally, prophecy is the end of the world. It usually goes that way. Just those 2 major forms of influence, referent power and persuasion. Others get a little more nuanced.
Okay. So, I mean, today with, like, the whole social media, you got Twitter, you got Facebook, all these, do you think that might be a bigger influence on people believing in the prophecies than it did earlier? I mean, with past prophecies, I mean, do you think it has a bigger influence today than it did then?
I don't see any evidence that a message coming over social media will be more effective than a message delivered face-to-face. It may be delivered more quickly over the social media. That doesn't mean necessarily being more effective. In fact, it may not be as effective, but it certainly has a lot more reach, as people in, say, mass media have known for a long time. Right? So it'll get there faster, but on the other hand, if the end of the world is going to be the 21st of December, it would get there. It would diffuse throughout the population that's going to diffuse by then, with social media, without social media. So probably get a bigger buzz in the media because it's more people hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't see anything special about social media in this case.
Okay. Do you have anything to state?
I don't think so.
Anything else you want to add?
No,
Okay.
Not really my area of expertise, but those are a few things.
Well, anything. I mean, you gave us some great stuff, so.
Okay.